Hello and welcome to Stay Calm and Sew a Mask with the Macedon Public Library. My name is Jessica Saccone. I am a library clerk at the Macedon Library. So I'm here today to show you how to sew your own mask since, particularly where we are in upstate New York, it is required that everybody wear a mask when they're in public places. So what I did today is, you'll see that this is dinosaur print because I'm making one for both of my kids as well as myself, but I started with my sons. So, because I thought this one would be the most visible on film. Before I forget to mention, I did do two different colors of fabric, one for the front and one for the back. The reason I did that was so that it'd be easy to distinguish which was the front, which was the back. Also, just another little note is that I did use ribbon for the ties. The reason I did that is because the elastic that goes around your ears is basically impossible to find right about now. And I didn't have any from previously, so I needed to come up with a new solution. I used ribbon. You can also use little strips of fabric that you fold over and press with an iron and then sew it that way. I don't have quite that dexterity. Another thing, just a little tip, is if you are using the acrylic ribbon, what you can do to keep the ends from fraying is just take like a little lighter or something and get the ribbon close to the flame, but not in it, and it will melt the ends together. That'll keep the ribbon from fraying. But as I mentioned before I started recording, is that I did not have the capacity to film myself doing the actual process, but I did take several pictures of every step along the way and put together a little presentation. So I'm going to share that now. Get that pulled up. Okay, so what you can see here is I made a little document with the pictures. What you are going to need for this project is you are going to need obviously some kind of fabric. This is just, I used just cotton fabric. These are actually little squares that I just bought at a local store that I think are usually for maybe quilting or just smaller projects. But yeah, this is just cotton fabric. You need at least 2 layers. You can do 3 if you wanted maybe extra filtering. You can actually add another layer in there, depending on your sewing machine or what you're working with, that you have a sturdy enough needle to go through several layers of fabric. I used 1/4 inch wide ribbon. I cut 4 lengths of it to 15 inches long. Oh, for the fabric, you're going to want to cut your layers 9 inches by 6 inches. You do need you don't actually need a sewing machine. You could do this project by hand, but the sewing machine will make it a little bit faster. You do still need, clearly you're going to need a thread and, a color of your choice. I used black because it happened to be what my sewing machine was already loaded up with, and I didn't have that much of a preference. So, but you can certainly use, a thread that matches or a contrasting color if you'd like. You will also need a thread and needle for a little bit of hand sewing, scissors, some nice sharp scissors for cutting your materials, a measuring tape or a ruler. And I put that the iron was optional, but several of the steps I do mention using the iron. If you don't have an iron, the fabric might be a little wrinkly. When you're done with the project, you might just want to throw it in, maybe dampen it and throw it in the dryer to kind of press out any wrinkles. But okay, so your first step is you're going to prep your materials. It's always, projects like this always go a little easier if you have everything laid out ahead of time. And it seems like no matter how much I try, though, I could not find scissors to save my life, because I think my kids have, at this point, have done several craft projects of their own and taken all the scissors. So I finally did have to use my hair cutting scissors, which is like the absolute forbidden. You don't want to use fabric scissors on anything else, and you don't want to use hair cutting scissors on anything else. But You got to do what you got to do, I guess. So I do not have one of those little pre-measured sewing boards, the grids. So I do, in that picture, first picture that you can see, I have a pencil. That is a fabric pencil that I used for marking off when I measured my materials. So the first thing I did was I, prepped all my materials. I've got my iron there. I've got my sewing machine is just off camera. I've got needles, thread, measuring tape, pins for, pinning the project in place. And I did use the, little colored pencil, fabric pencil to mark my lines. Next, you're going to want to measure and cut your materials. So you need at least 2 rectangles of cloth measuring 6 by 9 inches. As I said, you can add an optional 3rd layer for additional filtration if you'd like. And then I did cut 4 lengths of ribbon to 15 inches long. If I went a little longer than I thought I would need, because you could always trim those afterwards. As I said, a lot of people are looking for the mask with the ear loops, the elastic that loops over your ear. I could not find it. If you do happen to have some thin elastic, what you can do is cut 2 lengths to, I believe it's about 8 inches long. And instead of pinning when I talk about pinning the ribbons into place, instead of pinning 1 to each corner, you would take 1 length of the elastic, pin it to 1 corner, loop it to the next short corner, and pin it so that you have 1 loop on each side, and that will go inside the piece when you sew it, so that when you turn it right side out, they will be on the outside. But I had to use 4 different lengths of ribbon for my mask. Oops, let me get down here. Okay, so first I laid out my first piece of fabric. Well, what I did in between, and I just didn't share the picture of it, is once I cut out my fabric, I did iron it because it did have a lot of creases in it from being folded up from the way that I bought it at the store. So I did grab my iron, used a little bit of steam to get the cotton fabric to lie flat. The first thing I did was face my first piece of fabric right side up. I think this picture might have gotten flipped upside down, but that's fine. It just shows it like my fabric looks like it's upside down with the pattern, but that's okay. And I pinned each ribbon to the corners, starting about a ½ inch up from the corner. And I did that with each piece of ribbon, as you can see there. And what I did was I decided to tie them together into a little knot so that I didn't accidentally sew over more of my ribbon than I intended to. I just wanted to sew it where it connects at the edges. So knowing me, I would most likely end up sewing over the whole length of ribbon and have to undo the whole thing. So I did contemplate calling this project, so learn to sew a mask, AKA learn from my mistakes, because I do have a tendency. I am not I would call myself a beginner sewer, beginner to maybe intermediate, but not even that would be giving myself airs that I don't possess. So this project is very simple. So if any of you out there are wondering about your sewing skills, it is, if I can do it, you can do it, basically. So I did tie the ribbon into the center there to make sure I gathered them up and tied them into a little loose knot so that they didn't get accidentally sewn over. Then with the second layer of fabric, and this is important if you're using a fabric with a pattern, I used just a gray fabric that pretty much looked the same on each side. So there was really no right side or wrong side to that one. But if you are using a pattern, you want to put it down so that the wrong side is facing up, meaning the side without the pattern on it. Then you want to carefully remove those pins and repin it so that the ribbon is still in the same place. So you don't want your ribbon to move. You just want to kind of readjust so that you are now putting that pin through the top layer of fabric, the ribbon, and the bottom layer of fabric. You can also, since I had that, if you're using the elastic, your fabric might not bulge much, so you might not even need to pin it much around the edges. But since I made that little knot of ribbon in the center, my fabric was kind of, pushed up a little bit. So I did, oh, I guess I didn't include that picture. I did pin around the edges about every inch and a half, just to keep the work together and to keep the edges together. When you start sewing, you are going to line up your fabric under the foot of your sewing machine. I allowed for about 1/4 inch of seam release from the edge. You do want to start about 3/4 of the way down one side. I chose one of the shorter edges. So you're starting a little more than halfway down, and that is so that when you come back around to the other end of the piece, you're going to leave about 2 inches of a gap unsewn, and that's so you can turn your piece right side out. So, and as I did put a note there. It said, be careful not to sew over your ribbons except where they attach at the edges. Whenever it comes to sewing on a sewing machine, you do want to begin by locking your stitches into place. My sewing machine has a handy little button for that. So I sew a few stitches, I press the button, it automatically sews back 3 stitches, and then I can just keep going forward. If you have a machine that doesn't have that, then what you do is just sew a few stitches forward, use the hand wheel to sew back a few stitches, and then continue forward. When you do get to a rib of the part where the ribbons are, it's not a bad idea to back over those as well to kind of reinforce where those are attached. You do want to stop with your needle in the down position when you get towards the corner, and that is so that you can easily turn the piece without worrying about readjusting it and your thread coming loose, being loose or anything like that. So you make sure. Some machines also have that as an automatic setting. So if you have that, go ahead and set that. If you don't, just make sure that before you lift up the foot to turn the piece, you make sure the needle is down through the fabric to hold it into place, and then just pivot your work 90 degrees. Again, with about 1/4 inch of seam release, but on a project like this, it's not. You just want to make sure your seams are straight. it's the seam release in and of itself isn't the most dire, since we're just making a rectangle. But as you'll see, even I managed to wander off a little bit. So one of my seams isn't the straightest. But you can see here, this is where the top picture is where I've stopped with the needle in the down position. I lifted the foot, rotated my piece 90 degrees, put the foot back down, and then kept sewing. So as I said, you're going to go all the way around. You're going to repeat at each corner. You're going to stop with the needle down, rotate lift up the foot, rotate the piece 90 degrees, keep sewing. When you get back around to the side that you began, you want to, and it's very important, you need to leave yourself an open space of about 2 inches. This is so that you can turn your piece right side out. I didn't do it on this piece, but I have done it in the past where I've just kept sewing right along and sewed right up to where I began and realized, oh, wait, and then you have to go back and rip your seams up. So when you do get to having that space of about 2 inches, inch and a half, then you do want to make sure, again, to lock your stitches, back stitch about 3 stitches, stitch forward those 3 stitches, so you have an area where the stitches are going over each other. And that's when you can bring your needle up, lift your foot, pull the piece off the machine, trim your thread. And now we are going to start working. Oh, I'm sorry. This is when it is still inside out. It is a good idea to trim your corners so you don't have bulk in your corners, so that you can get your corners to push out nice and sharp. I didn't do this at the time. I trimmed the corners, but once I did that, I realized I should have actually trimmed the excess fabric off of the edges too. I could have neatened that up and made it a little easier when I got to the stage of doing the pleats. It would have been less fabric to push through, but I didn't do that, and it wasn't the hugest thing. It was just something that once I did it, I realized, oh, I kind of wish I'd done that. I wish I'd trimmed off that excess fabric. So, but it definitely helps to trim off the corners, because that way you can get your corners pressed out. So you do, at that point, you can push the fabric through the hole that you've left yourself, the space that you've left yourself, just keep working at it, excuse me, and pushing it through until your piece is right side out. I don't know what, all of a sudden I got a frog in my throat. To push out your corners, you can just use, I didn't find it all that hard, but if you do want to just use like a pen cap, or if you've got a chopstick or something, you can use that to just kind of push those corners out nice and neat. As you can see there on the right side, my seam kind of wandered a little bit. But you know, once you have your mask turned right side out, with that opening, you do want to fold the seams over, and you can just kind of finger press the seam nice and flat so that it looks like the rest of the mask, and then take a warm iron and just press the whole project flat. When it came to sewing the gap shut, I couldn't find a way to record that and do it at the same time, just because I don't have anything to a stand or anything to hold my phone or any recording device. So I did, when it comes to sewing the gap shut, it really kind of depends on your personal preference. If you don't mind seeing those few stitches, then just, you know, like I said, press the seam closed and you can just do a running stitch over it. Or I had heard of this ladder stitch, which kind of hides your stitches. So I decided to do that. You can see it here. I just took a needle and thread. I thought I took a picture of, oh, no. I guess I didn't include that picture where so at this point, you're going to thread a regular needle with some of your, whatever color thread you're using. I just did the simple technique of doubling up the thread. So I took a long length of thread, pulled the needle on to about halfway, you know, matched up the ends and just did a simple knot. And then how I sewed it so that the string, the knot wasn't showing, was that I went to the inside of my fabric underneath where on one side I had folded it over. Sorry, I'm trying to think of how to explain it. Where I'd folded it over, I went in between that fold of one of the colors of fabric so that the knot would be inside. Once I was done sewing, the knot was inside my piece. And then with the ladder stitch here, you can see if you're starting at A, where your needle is up, you know, your thread is up through the fabric, you go over to B and go in, but what you're doing is you're actually weaving your needle between the edge where you folded the fabric together. So if you're using fabric A and fabric B, like I am, if fabric A is the dinosaur print and fabric B is the gray, you're going to go in between that fold of fabric A. So your stitches are being hidden in between those two layers, and you're going back and forth. There are plenty of tutorials on this too. That's how I figured out how to do it, because if I just looked at a diagram, I'm not very good at just going straight from the diagram. It doesn't translate. I like to watch the YouTube videos. But I mean, it did come out kind of nice. It did hide where that opening was, like, so that you couldn't have been able to tell where I left that opening. It looked like a finished piece. Um, it didn't really, all that effort didn't really matter when it came to sewing my pleats, because you'll see in a second, I ended up just sewing those by hand, and they're a little bit messy, but since this is a mask for a 8-year-old, all he cares about is the dinosaurs. So it wasn't too bad. To make the pleats, you do want to measure approximately an inch from the top and start to fold over the fabric, about half an inch of fabric, and pin it into place. I can say all that, but really I discovered that the easiest thing was just to eyeball it, just to rather than get out a measuring tape and really try to measure in such a small space. I just decided to do it by eye, and had to just kind of work at it a little bit till I got to where I liked it. And this is where it would have helped to trim off the excess fabric on the inside, because my sewing machine, I do have a needle sturdy enough to go through thicker fabric like that, because at this point you've got it at least 4 layers of fabric, but with the parts I didn't trim off, that made it 8. So I just didn't want to mess around with it and change the needle and change it back later for other projects. So I ended up just sewing this part by hand. I just did a running stitch, and then I went back and went over it again. And then you can see here, this is the back side of it. The gray side will always be the back side. So that's why you can see my little bit of messier stitches. So again, learn from my mistakes. So, or if you don't mind, because I know who the person who's going to wear this mask, he doesn't mind at all. So you can see here's the front side of it. So once you've done one side of the pleats, you go to the other side, and you're going to just make sure you're doing your pleats in the same direction. So don't just flip the work over to the other side and do it the same way you did it the first time, because you'll have pleats going in one direction on one side and one direction on the other. So you want to make sure that your pleats are going in the same direction. And again, I sewed those by hand. And I hit the knot on that one by, again, weaving the needle between those layers of fabric. So when I got to the final stitch, what I did was I went into the top layer of fabric and came out through the seam where I sewed it together with the sewing machine on the edge, and snipped the thread so that the loose threads were inside the piece. So that way I didn't have those just hanging out. And at that point, your mask is done. So you can see here that I've got a mask with the ribbons sticking out of the edge. It's got pleats. It's got, you know, at least enough contouring to cover your face. Here is my son, who I had to chase down to pose for this picture, because he was interested in the dinosaur mask, but he wasn't all that interested in standing still to have his picture taken. So here he is wearing it. I did just tie the ribbons, you know, behind the top ribbons go up over his ears, and I tied it to the back of his head. And then the other ones just went low, you know, to the back of his neck, and I tied them down there. And just to show you by contrast, this same, you don't need to make any size modifications for whether you're making a children's mask or a adult mask. Here is me wearing the same mask, you know, just to show you that you didn't need to modify it. I mean, for a children's mask, you could make it a little bit smaller, especially if you've got real little guys, but you know, just by maybe making it, instead of 6 by 9, you could make it maybe like 5.5 by 8. Or something to make it a little smaller. So now your mask is done, and you get to clean up the mess that you've made. And I certainly hope that your mess is less than my mess. I just thought I'd share. all the trials and tribulations. And that's what, you know, I ended up with at the end. So, but, you know, it was definitely fairly simple. I wish, all things being equal, I would have preferred to have elastic rather than ties, but you know, at this point you got to take what you can. I think for my skill level, this is about as difficult as I wanted to go. I know there are some like more contoured masks tutorials out there, but for someone who's a novice or maybe a little nervous about sewing, or maybe you just haven't done it in a while, or you know, you just struggle with the terminology, because I know I do. If I try to watch some sewing tutorials, I'm just like, wait, what does that mean? So so I found this to be fairly easy. It really wasn't all that frustrating. You know, despite my mess at the end, I really did find it quite easy to do. Mostly what took me the most amount of time was because, since I was doing this as a program to show you guys, that I had to take pictures all along the way. So that was really the part that took the longest, was the stopping every step along the way and taking a picture. I actually took a lot more pictures than I shared. I just figured that those were, you know, the ones that showed you the most important steps. And I am quite pleased with it. I do think that it'll work very well for what we need. Some modifications that you might want to do is, if you do have pipe cleaners or some sort of little like bendable wire that isn't going to poke through the fabric, when you are on the step where you're still having the work inside out, you could also attach something there so that you could have, you know, that moldability around your nose, because this is just kind of loose, and you want to tie it. If you tie it tight enough, you'll be fine. But I do see how maybe with the kids, it might be easier to have something that molds to their nose so that they don't feel like the, you know, mask is up here. That's the one thing I think that I would modify if I could go back. But I might even be able to find something and maybe glue it, you know, and modify that. But yeah, I think that is about it for how it went. I think it went fairly quickly. It wouldn't take, I mean, maybe from beginning to end, it would take maybe 20-30 minutes, you know, if you're not stopping to document the whole process. So, but yeah, I'm quite pleased with it. I'm going to make another one for my daughter with some Batgirl superhero stuff. These are the things that I bought. They're 100% cotton. Altogether, they're called Fat Quarter. And altogether, it is 18 inches by 21 inches, which was more than enough fabric. I've actually got plenty left over. So, and I think this was like $2 or $3 at Walmart. So the ribbon that I bought was like another $1 and some odd cents. So really quite a cost-effective project. The only issue is if you can, hopefully you can either find the materials you need, or, you know, maybe find materials around your house. But I hope this was helpful to everybody. I hope this was informative. You know, we're all in this together. I know we're all needing to wear the mask while we're out and about. So this is a nice way to not only fulfill that, but also, you know, especially like if you have kids, like I do, you know, the fun prints are nice for them, because this is a bit of a strange, difficult time to tell, you know, your kids to here, wear this mask. So at least if you can make it a little bit fun, you know, that is take some of the pressure off. So if anybody has any questions, you know, just go ahead and let me know. Otherwise, I think we'll be done. So I think I'm going to stop the recording now. And if you have any questions, just go ahead and ask me after the meeting, but I just wanted to say to everybody, thank you very much for joining me. If you do want to see more programs like this, please contact the Maston Public Library. Definitely let us know, what it is that you would like us to see, what you would like us to present you with. We're really having a lot of fun putting together these virtual programs. So thank you so much for joining me. Everybody have a great and safe day. Thank you very much.